I want to welcome you to this Crown Seminar, our first of 2025. And I think there's no more fitting way to start our series than celebrating and discussing the publication of a new book by the Crown Center's own faculty leave fellow, Candace Lukasik, Martyrs and Migrants, Coptic Christians, and the Persecution Politics of U.S. Empire, which will be coming out very shortly with NYU Press. When not at Crown, Dr. Lukasik is an assistant professor of religion and a faculty affiliate in anthropology and Middle Eastern cultures at Mississippi State University. Her research focuses on transnational politics of migration, violence, and indigeneity in the Middle East, specifically Egypt and Iraq, and its U.S. diasporas. And we're very lucky today to have Dr. Zainab Saleh in conversation with her about this book. She is the Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Koshland Director of John P. Hurford Center for the Arts and Humanities at Haverford College. Dr. Saleh is the author of Return to Rune, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia, published by Stanford University Press in 2021, which received the Evelyn Shakir Nonfiction Award at the Arab American Book Awards. And her current book project, Uprooted Memories, Citizenship, Denaturalization, and Mass Deportation in Iraq, looks at the legacies of British colonialism in Iraq by examining how a politics of empire has informed notions of subjectivity and citizenship, modernity and nationhood, and has shaped experiences of displacement. Thank you both so much for being with us today. A quick reminder that the seminar is being recorded and will be posted after the event on our YouTube channel, as well as on the Crown Center's website at brandeis.edu/crown. The format for today's seminar will be as follows. Dr. Lukasik will start us off with a brief overview of her book. Following this, she and Dr. Saleh will speak for about 30 minutes, and then at approximately 11:45, Dr. Saleh will moderate a 30-minute Q&A with you, our audience. If you have questions for our guests at any point during their discussion, please drop it in the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. And we will wrap up promptly at 12:15. So with that, Dr. Lukasik, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ramyara, and thank you, Zainab, for being here. It's really an honor to be in conversation with you. I feel like a lot of this project really developed in conversation, not only with your work, but just together. And I feel really lucky for that. So I'm just going to share my screen and give a little bit of context to our conversation today. Okay. So over the past 2 decades, Western politicians, think tanks, and NGOs have rechanneled their efforts into saving Middle Eastern Christians as violence against minoritized communities continue to rise in the wake of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, the Arab Spring, and the emergence of ISIS. And most recently, the future of Syria's Christians after the fall of Bashar al-Assad has been a major news item. To the extent that Middle Eastern Christians have registered in Western political imaginaries, they are either invoked to justify military intervention or as an exemption to anti-Muslim immigration policies because of their connections as Christians with the West. And such Western religious and political interest has been overwhelmingly concerned with their decline in the region. And this graph from an article in The Economist, originally published in 2017, kind of around the time of a number of bombings that took place in Egypt of churches, that what we can get, that I will further discuss and we talk about in the Q&A. It frequently makes the rounds on social media in kind of arguing about Muslim intolerance and persecution under Islamic rule. So this is kind of evidence of that, of their decline. So in the context of this demographic decline, Western focus on Middle Eastern Christians centers on their Christian resilience in the Muslim majority region, glorifying these Christians as being part of ancient churches and as modern day martyrs. Yet while these communities have increasingly migrated to the West, resulting in demographic decline in the Middle East, they have also faced new forms of exclusion in the so-called lands of immigration. So let me expand on that puzzle in the case of Egypt's Coptic Christians, who are the focus of my book, Martyrs and Migrants. So Coptic Christians are the largest community of Christians remaining in the Middle East. Their church, with roots that date back to the 1st century, has branched out globally since the mid-20th century. And though figures are contested, Copts constitute roughly 10% of the Egyptian population and have an ever-growing diaspora. Since the 2011 Egyptian revolution and a rise in subsequent attacks on the community and their places of worship, Copts have been increasingly immigrating to the United States as well as other places, but especially the US. Although the main ways Copts immigrate to the US are not asylum, as one might think, but rather the US diversity visa, also known as the green card lottery, an immigration route based on random selection, which the book discusses at length. And in fact, the largest permanent diaspora population of Coptic Christians lies in the United States, where upwards of 75% of the Egyptian population in the US is Coptic, according to the New Immigrant Survey, which is quite a change from their minority status in Egypt. So with this background on the community and its migration patterns, let me break down a bit more how the glorification of Coptic martyrs in the American religious imagination came to be. So since the 1980s, the death of Coptic Christians has been made legible to American, particularly evangelical audiences, through the theology and global imagination of the persecuted church, which argues that Christians around the globe are currently persecuted more than any other time in history. Once the objects of American missionary efforts, Coptic Christians have been reimagined as Americans' Christian brothers and sisters in their suffering for Christ. And the embrace of Coptic Christians by American Christian conservatives and the US state has also provided a new avenue for the transnational minority activism of Coptic migrants to address their grievances in Egypt to a new captivated audience, but also using new vocabulary and terminology as well, as both of these images kind of allude to, both the use of Holocaust and thinking about Christian genocide. However, this activism and foreign policy level focus have produced fraught predicaments for Christian migrants from the Middle East. Once in the US, Copts share experiences of anti-Muslim racism with other Arab and Muslim communities in a post-9/11 America. While US religious and political support for Copts and other Middle Eastern Christians hinges on their special status as victims of Islamic violence, homeland contexts of sectarian violence and minority persecution are also reinterpreted by new political priorities in diaspora that far exceed the details of the original context. So these layered dynamics that impact upon Middle Eastern Christians in particular compel specific forms of social belonging and political organizing among diaspora communities like American Copts that ultimately distance them racially and religiously from communities they once shared life with in Egypt. Or put it another and more blunt way, while intense episodes of violence targeting Copts in Egypt from Islamist groups or the government is not something to overlook or push aside in the favor of a narrative of coexistence or national unity, focused only on those episodes misses out on the more complicated friendships and animosities between neighbors who are part of different religious communities in Egypt. And Martyrs and Migrants, my book, kind of tackles these dynamics in its chapters by documenting histories of diaspora activism, processes of immigration, narratives of asylum, post 9/11 racialization, and Coptic participation in the security state and global conservative movements, with a consistent shifting in scenes among research sites between Egypt and the US, which I'm sure we'll get into in the Q&A in our conversation. So before I conclude a very brief introduction and turn it over to Zainab, I'd like to summarize a main kernel from the book that will help us to kind of think together about the struggles Christians in and from the Middle East face that are often overlooked. Mainly that Coptic Christians and all Christians in and from the Middle East have large, very large diasporas in the West, some even exceeding those that remain in their homelands, most especially thinking about Assyrians and Chaldeans in Iraq, for example. And these diasporas have major impacts here and there. And my book, Martyrs and Migrants, examines the everyday experiences of Coptic Christians as they deal with the tension between their minority status in Egypt and their racial religious placement within an American Christian conservative landscape. The Coptic struggle to grapple with these different minority positions between Egypt and the US, between here and there, shapes their unique political orientations and sets up their position in broader and contested US geopolitics concerned both with human rights advocacy and counterterrorism efforts. And that does not mean Coptic migrants, surely instrumentalized by these broader structures of power, are simply conscripts of US empire and kind of like cogs in an imperial machine, or that they are overwhelmingly resistors to it. Instead, the book offers a window to another path by moving with Coptic migrants to think about how imperial forces ambiguously shape minority communities in migration, whether in new interpretations of their identity or the transformation of their politics and religious traditions. And the book takes seriously the predicaments that these diasporas face, but uses a transnational approach by sharing scenes between Egypt and the US, kind of better attend to the global circuits of power that remake such communities. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Zainab for our conversation to elaborate on some of these points more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I would like to start by thanking the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis University for inviting me to be part of this event. And especially I would like to thank Dr. Ramiam Roussech and Julio Macon and Marilyn Horowitz for making this event possible. And of course, I would love to thank Dr. Candace Lukasik for inviting me to be in conversation with her book. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with this book. I would like to, before I start asking Candace some questions, I really would like just to emphasize a few points about this book. And I really would love for people to read it. It's an amazing book. So this book offers a breathtaking analysis of the political landscape that Egyptian Copts in the United States and Egypt navigate and promote. Based on a multi-sided ethnographic work and archival research, Candace offers an informed view of the development of Egyptian Copts, political mobilization in the diaspora, and the different discourses they employ in order to fit within the Christian right, whether in terms of the politics of persecution at the hand of Muslims or the anxiety over the increasing secularism and progressive thought in the United States. Another element I would really love to emphasize about this book is that it really looks at at diasporic politics through looks at it historically and at the present by looking at colonial classification systems under the British, national rule in Egypt, and the Cold War politics and right-wing sensibilities in the United States. So all these elements that Candace really bring together very beautifully, very powerfully. And the book really shows how Egyptian Copts are caught up in the discourse of persecution in order to shed light on the violence their communities are experiencing in the Middle East, but they are also racialized at the same time, given their Middle Eastern background. So I would like actually to start by asking Candace this question. One of the things that I really appreciate about this book is the question of entanglement, in terms of the entanglement of diasporic politics with U.S. imperial discourses, and the entanglement of Egypt's modern history with colonial rules. So there are many entanglements that you really talk about in this book. And the way you lay bare entangled histories and networks shows why it's problematic to face on the nation state only. And for the audience, what I mean here is that, like, we can't really understand politics in the Middle East without understanding the impact of empire, whether it was the British Empire or American imperialism in the present. So that's really an important part of the book about this entanglement, that things are not just happening in the nation state. These things are entangled. So rather than, and one of the other things that Candace does really beautifully in this book is that rather than focusing on the US empire just as a military and economic power, she really looks at how Christian Orientalist discourses dating back to the British rule have informed sensibilities and identities among Egyptian Copts. So my question is related to the way entanglement always exists in tension in this book. And I would love for you to elaborate on that for the audience, Candace.
Thank you so much, Zainab. And I think that, I mean, part of the reason why I think we've been in conversation for several years now is because you also approached in your book U.S. empire in this way and thinking about encounter. So you're gesturing to entanglement, and I think that's an interesting and I think more important way to tease out what I kind of deploy in the book of this binary between religion and race, or thinking about the ways in which blood, particularly like as a substance that comes out in these ways of thinking about Copts both as martyrs but as racialized migrants, and how that kind of is infused together and shown in different ways, comes from understanding that Copts are not just simply a diaspora in the US, connected back to Egypt, but that there are these different layers that are both historical, but also imperial, national, and on kind of different local levels as well too. And so like the ways in which I think about entanglement, whether it be between religion and race, or in particular thinking about persecution and power, which is the kind of subject of the first half of the book, is really to think about how Middle Eastern Christians kind of, in many ways, operate off of this duality that is both kind of instrumentalized, but impacts the ways in which Copts can be in Egypt and in the US context. So to kind of think about this in the context of like persecution and power, we can kind of think about how Copts in the US that are active in advocating for Copts back in Egypt on the basis of persecution, how and who they appeal those politics towards in the US kind of geopolitical context. And most of those folks that are able to kind of hear that message are from kind of right-wing constituencies in the US, whether they be evangelical, but also Catholic and other, Christian right communities that see Copts as Christians and as Christians that can advance a particular narrative about Islam and Muslims. And so Copts appeal to those particular political agendas because those are the political kind of forces that will listen to what their experiences have been in the Egyptian context. So whether that be, for example, in one of my slides, Eric Matexas, one of these big American evangelical figures, utilizes the image of the 21 Coptic martyrs of Libya who were beheaded by ISIS affiliates in February of 2015 as a way to kind of think about Christian persecution in the United States. And while many Copts were kind of offended by the use of that imagery, it gestures to the ways in which the specific Coptic context is kind of fused into these different imperial discourses. And so there's a lot of different ways in which the Coptic context becomes both specified in, a particular incident that happens, whether it be in Libya, in the context of that particular incident, or bombings that occurred during my field work, like at different churches in 2017, how those incidents get taken up both by Copts in diaspora, but also American like political and religious networks that kind of melt into one another and become hard to kind of disentangle from what is a particularly indigenous Coptic narrative and what is that of an American kind of imperial narrative. And that's what the book is really trying to kind of think about and tackle. I think that you're on mute, Zainab, sorry.
Thank you for this answer. And I would like to follow up with a question about the ongoing colonial afterlives of a British rule in Egypt, because one of the things, like one of the categories, one of the important categories that the British used always is that Egyptians, and especially Egyptian Muslims, are backward, are savages, and they are racially different from Copts, who are seen as being more pure and descendants of ancient Egyptians. So how is the contemporary US discourse on Christians in the Middle East predicated upon these contradictory discourses that informed British narratives, in the sense that on the one hand, Egyptian Copts are seeing as not as different racially from Muslim Egyptians, but and seeing them as more like advanced in terms of civilization, yet they still see them as still being savages, like not completely on par with European Christians. So I'm very much interested in this kind of impact, the ongoing really afterlives of a British colonial understanding right now at the present moment.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, again, getting back to the idea of entanglement, a lot of the discourses, the relationships that occurred like under British colonialism, talking about the 19th into the 20th century between Copts and whether they be kind of Orientalist travelers, et cetera. A lot of the discourses that were deployed then are almost kind of identical to now. And I say that only because, I mean, for those that know him, there's a very famous like Assyriologist, Archibald Sayce, who I cite in the introduction, who talks about the Copts in a particular. There was kind of a pamphlet of proceedings thinking about the Coptic question in the early 20th century. Talks about the Copts as real family people. They're part of, and because they're real family people, they're part of Christian, Western Christian civilization. And, it's almost identical to a tweet that came out from now President Donald Trump in like a few days before the election in late October, which came as a shock, praising the Copts, the Coptic community in the United States, as being, not only the, descendants of these persecuted generations, that they've been persecuted for centuries, but also that they're real family people. And that's what makes them, and, endorsers of conservative values. And that's what makes them real Americans. And so this tweet came out and it, was spread far and wide. And it was very similar in some ways to this connection to family values that Archibald Sayce also deployed in the early 20th century, kind of comparing in many ways like, Middle Eastern Christians, whether they be, Assyrians or Copts in a similar fashion. And that was in juxtaposition to somebody like, the Earl of Cromer, Evelyn Baring, who, was a consul general in Egypt, who saw the Copts as simply just another Muslim, that they're just pseudo-Muslims, right? That Egyptians are all the same. And that particular element comes out not, I think, as directly in the US context, meaning that, for example, when the NYPD had their surveillance program in the New York, New Jersey area, they came out with a list of ancestries of interest, and one of them was Egypt, but they had exceptions. I think one of them was Iranian Jews, and they named that Iranian Jews, and the other one was Coptic Christians, Egyptian Copts, and but even despite that exception, in differentiating a Copt from a Muslim Egyptian, that becomes very hard in terms of kind of everyday interactions, or the ways in which they become Copts, become unrecognizable as Copts in everyday life. And I'll briefly kind of end my response just by gesturing to the context of a particular incident that happened at the Museum of the Bible, which the book does not talk about, but the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., very famous for its Coptic and other early Christian collections, stolen or not stolen. That's for another talk entirely. But in early 2019, there was a Coptic Christian asylum seeker who visited the museum with his church group, a Coptic church group, and was actually detained on the basis by the museum staff because they thought that he looked suspicious. And they questioned him for hours, and then eventually referred this person to the FBI. And there was a counterterrorism file opened against this Coptic Christian asylum seeker. And part of the reason that they said that they opened this file was because not only was he suspicious because he had a beard or whatever else, but that the usage of his name was quote unquote particularly common among Muslim terrorists. Just like, having three names, for example. And so there are ways in which Copts cannot kind of escape even these broader, racialized and securitized structures in the US that say, well, we're not going after these Christian Egyptians, we're going after these Muslim Egyptians. It's hard to disentangle those things when Copts and Muslims in Egypt share a lot of very similar, cultural, social, and even religious, ways of being and forms of life.
Thank you, Candace. I would like to shift now to talk really about your fieldwork. And really Candace, by the way, for the audience, she's really modest. The way she does multi-sited ethnographic work in this book is really breathtaking. It's amazing. She does it intelligently and smartly and really in a very flowing way. So one of the things I really would like to go back to is your field work in the village of Bahjura, because you don't treat the village just as a village in Egypt, dismissed as oh, this is a village in Egypt. Rather, you treat Bahjura as a site of empire. So the majority of really multi-sited ethnographies focus on multiple cities like Beirut, New York, Paris. It's always in this regard, multi-sited ethnographic work is done. Especially because anthropologists, as you state in the book, think of the remote village as the location of traditional culture. By contrast, you argue that Bahjura is the center of empire. While this focus on Bahjura shows the inadequacy of the use of the nation state as the sole angle to understand local politics, it aims to highlight the community's desires, imagination, and interpretations of global discourses on the region. So I'm interested to hear about your field work there and some of the insights that you can share with us today about field work in the village and what you found in Bahjura and these interconnections between Coptic diasporic communities and the village Bahjura.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I feel like that one is actually my favorite only because Bahjura is, you know, and I say this with my full heart, is one of the most interesting places that I've ever been to because it is seemingly just this, ordinary poor village. That's what that's what it's perceived as, even by, I think, a lot of, diaspora organizations that, come back to Egypt and go to the village as like the site of, like of service, of khidma, of, doing service to their brethren back home. But the village of Bahjura was the center of, in the late 19th, early 20th century, was the center of huge Coptic landowning families that controlled a lot of the Egyptian economy. Granted, at the same time, a lot of those Coptic landowning families, as other landowning families, were propped up by the British colonial government. Absolutely. But because of that kind of class greatness, today the remnants of those colonial afterlives, that I would say legacy is shared by all Copts, like in the village, and I think beyond it, as something of like a lost greatness. And you see that in Bahjura's like landscape, just beautiful, like gorgeous villas that are there, that remain there, family archives that are there. And that's part of the reason why, I was able to do this field work, is that the village is the site of empire, but it's also was the site of a previous empire as well, the British Empire, and other empires too, that and imperial kind of forces that had their tentacles throughout Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, I just want to mention this before kind of getting to the more contemporary reasons by which I think of Bahjura as the heart of empire, that is the heart of this project, is that Upper Egypt in general, and I think rural areas in general throughout kind of Middle Eastern history, but especially in the Egyptian context, have been kind of left out. I can't even say that that's like beginning to change either. Because of, different ways in which Upper Egypt seems to be kind of a hard place to do field work, or a hard place to do archival work. I mean, one person who's been able to do this so, I think, beautifully is Zainab Saleh, and her Imagine Empires book, which was also informed mine incredibly, because she did a lot of this work in the broader Enna province. It has been a kind of a region, which is almost the majority of Egypt's territory, left out of Egyptian history. And I think that has left out a lot of really important stories. And so the reason that Bahjura for me and for this project is the heart of empire today, and particularly US empire, is that it and a lot of other villages, magnificent villages that have these landowning family legacies, et cetera, that remain kind of in the landscape of the land, is that a lot of the Coptic Christians in this village and elsewhere have left. And how are they leaving? They're leaving through the green card lottery. And I don't say that as something kind of conspiratorial, although when I first began doing field work, a lot of priests in New Jersey would say this is like, it's so weird. I get, you know, an entire village was empty because of this green card lottery. Is it really, you know, a random selection? That was actually said to me by a priest in New Jersey. And I think that there's just this way in which the sheer number of Copts that have come through the green card lottery is so overwhelming, especially over like the past decade, that it is unthinkable that all of these Copts would be randomly selected. And that has had an impact upon village life, intercommunal life between Muslims in the village that see the apartment buildings of and, you know, homes of Coptic Christians vacant. And what does that mean kind of to everyday life when Copts only come back during the summers or whatever else to visit, but they're no longer kind of there in the everyday. And so that's why the village itself and Bajura is kind of a key site to thinking about these different afterlives of empire and, you know, current processes of absence and presence of minority communities like Copts.
Thank you. So my other question is related to the politics of transnationalism. So transnationalism at the daily level is often studied through the lens of solidarity and activist networks. However, your book draws attention to what someone can call transnational conservatism, like in the right-wing discourses, like in the ways the right-wing discourses in the United States have shaped local discourses all over the world. For example, in terms of crackdown on women's rights. And actually, yesterday was a very sad day for Iraqi women because the Iraqi parliament just revoked the 1959 Iraqi personality status law, which really gave women's rights in terms of marriage, divorce, inheritance. So these discourses, like these crackdowns about women's rights, LGBTQ rights, are really becoming global. Like it's not just local or informed just by like all religions, supposedly. Like there is a whole local discourse, and social media is playing a huge role in this. I think this points like allude to the comment by one of your interlocutors, Nassim, who remarked that the enemies of Edward Said are the heroes of the Copt. So your book really speaks to the blind spots among liberals who think a marginalized status would entail a politics of solidarity with other dispossessed people. Your book speaks to the complexity, contradictions, and co-option as far as diasporic politics is concerned. And that's like really what makes the book unique, is that you managed to show all these entanglement, but also tension. You always talk about tension. So can you say please more about that, especially because like really your book moves away from seeing Middle Eastern communities through one lens, just like through the lens of religion or the lens of politics. Like you just really show how things are always in tension and are entangled and contradictory.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is one of the biggest stakes of the book and really kind of what it tries to lay out, because I don't want people to read this book and simply read it as, oh, okay, this is kind of just an explanation as to why Coptic Christians and other Middle Eastern Christian communities might engage in Islamophobic rhetoric, and you know that we're just placing them into that box. It's really trying to unpack and explain why Coptic Christians and other Middle Eastern Christian communities have been pushed into these particular conservative political networks, both in foreign policy networks, but also domestic political networks that reinscribe and translate their Christianity into a conservative lens. So whether that be in terms of foreign policy, advocating for war and more counterterrorism efforts that also kind of take up Copts along with it. Like if there's going to be, you know, let's say a military action in Iraq or elsewhere, that's going to impact, or in Egypt or wherever else, that's going to impact the Christians there too, right? And so in advocating like Christians or, any kind of ethnic minority lens that they identify with, whether being Assyrian or specifically Coptic, it's going to impact them too. And whether that be in the domestic kind of perspective of thinking about how Coptic Christianity is translated simply as Christianity for kind of right-wing political networks that also impact upon lower class and working class Copts and their livelihoods. But one thing I know we might be running out of time in terms of our conversation. One thing I really want to emphasize is that part of the reason why Coptic Christians and let's say a lot of other Middle Eastern Christian communities have not been a part of, let's say, quote unquote, Arab American kind of organizing. And it's not all Christian communities from the Middle East that are not in these groups, but specific ones, is that they see the ways in which those Arab American networks have rallied around thinking about, racial and ethnic kind of solidarity networks, thinking about kind of a critical approach to U.S. empire, has also brought in Muslims and Islam as a kind of an anti-imperial force. And I think that for a lot of communities like Copts, who have experienced like forms of discrimination and violence at the hands of, sometimes just Muslim neighbors, they have had to kind of contend with this shift in political axis, and who would listen to kind of them and their experiences of what they identify as persecution, kind of falls in line with more conservative and right-wing networks. And the kind of eschewing of that experience by left-wing and, Arab American, networks and organizing efforts, I think has been to the detriment of kind of more robust solidarity. So that's what I just want to emphasize, is that it's these kind of tensions that have led, I think, Copts and other Middle Eastern Christian communities to look to right-wing networks that recognize their experiences and their memories of violence and marginalization that is not recognized by others.
Thank you. So my last question before we start taking, and I'll give time for people to start asking questions. So I'll ask you that question. So in your conclusion, you show how these mainstream discourses among Copts in the US have sidelined working class Copts in terms of thwarting union solidarity with other communities such as Somalis or Kurds. Can you say something about the politics of class among the Copts and the new political visions that are emerging, which focus on building communities, demanding living wages and healthcare for poor Copts, and moving away from discourses of sectarianism?
Yeah, thank you. And just to make sure that my answer is as concise as possible, so we can open it up to the Q&A. The conclusion of the book really draws on the incredible organizing efforts of an organization out of Nashville, Tennessee, called the Al-Mahabba Center, run by Lydia Youssef. And she shared with me this. So the center basically comes from the perspective of the church in the Southern Diocese, and particularly its kind of capital, Nashville, has really formed with other more kind of conservative, right-wing Christian, white Christian networks in government and in other kind of organizing spaces that have really detracted from focusing on the vast majority of Copts in the Nashville area who are working class and poor, that have not addressed their needs. And many of these Copts work for the companies, most especially the Tyson Chicken Factory and others, that have had horrid conditions, especially under COVID and other subsequent years since then, and have seen kind of unionizing efforts that have tried to bring in Copts that have been kind of thwarted by the church and kind of other Christian conservative networks. And so this particular center is really trying to empower this community of Copts, which is the vast majority of Copts in the Nashville area, to say that there is another way of thinking about our Christianity and your particular lives in the US beyond a particular persecuted frame, that we can form solidarity networks with other peoples to live better than this. There's a lot of tensions associated with that too, that the conclusion kind of unpacks, but the work of the Al-Mahabba Center, I think, has been a source of, I think, hope for not only Copts in Nashville, but in terms of their social media interaction, Copts elsewhere in the United States too, to see that there is another ways to kind of think about our Christianity beyond these tensions within persecution politics that the book unfolds.
Thank you. So we'll turn to the questions from the audience. And I have a question from one person who actually is asking two questions. And they are asking, I'm wondering if Copts who left their villages in Upper Egypt to the US have started using money made there in building houses or buying land back home. I'm wondering if this could be cause of tension and stereotypical ideas about Copts being rich and hiding their wealth. And the second question is, I'm wondering if there are public Coptic figures who publicly distance themselves from right-wing Western politics. And if so, what kind of ideological background do they mobilize? Local patriotism and sovereignty, or third world politics, etc.?
These are great questions. Yeah, I think that the first one is important because this gets to kind of like why is a place like Bajura the heart of empire, is that you have a lot of Copts who obviously, you know, make more money abroad and send that back. And there is a way in which in the United States, and there's a way in which that creates certain tensions with other Muslim communities. But to be fair, though, in a place like Bajura as well, a lot of the Muslim communities there, Muslims and Christians, like went abroad from the 1970s onwards to the places like the Gulf and were circulating money back. So there's these kind of like layered tensions too, in that you have these Coptic landowning families who had to contend with seeing those that they described as their former workers, like making more money than them. But then you have Copts that are now kind of coming back, whether it be through, you know, remittances, but also coming back and serving the community from Western countries like the United States, that create certain tensions within the kind of village life as well. So it's you know, it's about buying, you know, new homes and buildings and things like that too, but it's about these circulations of people that create certain tensions on the everyday level too, I would say. And just to get to that, to the second question about different public figures, I mean, I think that the most recent public figure that I think has, you know, not gotten as much attention outside of Coptic like kind of internal Coptic circles in the United States was the recent kind of interim senator from the state of New Jersey after Bob Menendez was, you know, that's a whole other story, pushed aside for his true love for Egyptians and other Middle Eastern Christians in the form of gold bars, etc. You can look that one up later. But the interim senator from the state of New Jersey, in the meantime, was somebody by the name of George Henme, who Democrat, who advanced a lot of legislation that would seem to be like, you know, I think counterintuitive for what we imagine like Copts in politics to kind of look like. And many Copts that are in politics, including some of Trump's recent appointees, like the FDA commissioner, and others that will join the cabinet and his administration. George took, you know, a much more typically, you know, democratic and more kind of, I wouldn't say left wing, but more, you know, progressive stances during his time in Congress. But it, you know, those particular Coptic figures are just emerging, I think, but seem to not get the spotlight as much as these others because of the ways in which Middle Eastern Christians are understood to be automatically kind of conservative.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask two questions by two members of the audience. So one question is, how do you remain critical of paternalistic and imperial dynamics toward Kurds, toward Copts and other religious minorities in the MENA region without falling into the trap of erasing the very oppression and marginalization that these groups face? And another question is, does the American Coptic community lobby on behalf of the Egyptian government and stronger US support for President Sisi?
Yeah, two really important questions. I think until today, you know, I still wonder what the path kind of forward is between thinking about the tensions of these imperial dynamics that Copts, not just towards Copts, but like that Copts participate in, and other, you know, religious minorities, but, you know, really thinking about Christians in the Middle East and their advocacy networks in DC, like, and elsewhere. Like how to think about those efforts and those connections to conservative foreign policy networks versus pushing for and wanting to see a more progressive movement within these communities that in many ways kind of must displace their actual and real critique that brings them together, which is thinking about their experiences of oppression, marginalization, and persecution at the hands of, you know, Islamist networks, and also like their everyday Muslim neighbors. Like, how do you contend with that when there are a lot of Muslims that are a part in the United States that are a part of progressive networks? I mean, I think that in this recent election, the context of Dearborn, Michigan, and other tensions within the Muslim American kind of community have shown a light on ways in which maybe Copts and Muslims, Egyptian Muslims, and others can come together. I mean, in the book, I talk about a particular scene between a Coptic politician who's somebody who was campaigning to be in office, meeting with an Egyptian Muslim who he didn't know was an Egyptian Muslim because they were talking about the LGBTQ curriculum in New Jersey. And he didn't see him as a Muslim because they were talking about their shared efforts to block this curriculum. And he's like, well, you know, there's so many things that we share together, but it's through this kind of conservative force. So there's a lot of different layers to kind of thinking about like ways forward, but that also actually marginalize other people in the US context. So the second question, though, I think on on lobbying networks in American Coptic lobbying networks on behalf of the Egyptian government, and stronger support, US support for President Sisi. This is a very important question, and one that the book kind of tackles in different chapters in different ways, because part of the connection, particularly of the Coptic Church in the United States, it is connected I mean, there's actually a lot of dualism happening, a lot of entanglement happening with the Coptic Church's stances in the US, I will say that. Because at one point in you know, in one level, there would be kind of an engagement of the church with these kind of anti-Muslim, you know, what would be Islamophobic networks because of, you know, thinking about their persecution under Islam, et cetera. But at the same time, they're also connected to the Egyptian embassies and consulates in the US, thinking about a focus of national unity. So they are also kind of playing these like two different roles of like, we are a persecuted people, and we share in the persecution of other American Christians, but at the same time, we are also Egyptians, and we are together with our Egyptian Muslim brothers and sisters in our support, particularly of the Egyptian president, Sisi. So I would say that a lot of the lobbying efforts in the United States are also connected directly to transnational church politics in particular. I think that the broader American Coptic community is concerned very specifically with domestic conservative politics and thinking about persecution politics in US foreign policy, but the church is concerned with maintaining its image between here and there. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. The next question is actually related to just the last questions you answered. So the question is, please comment on the policies of the Egyptian government towards the Coptic diaspora community in the US. Has it made any efforts to develop a relationship with this community and mobilize its resources as a lobby for Egypt-US relations?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, even to the extent that the previous, for reasons that I won't get into now, but the previous minister of like diaspora relations for the Egyptian government was actually like a Coptic woman, because I think that they know, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that while there aren't specific numbers, there's only kind of inklings from like different, whether it be like surveys, et cetera, that the vast majority of Egyptians in the United States, the vast majority, we're not talking about like, 51%, we're talking about upwards between 65 and 75% of the Egyptian population in the US is Coptic. So when you think about that and think about, Egyptian nationalism abroad, you want to connect with what the largest constituency would be. And part of this is also too that when Egyptian Muslims immigrate to the United States, there's a broader Muslim American community that they come together in their shared Muslim identity and their shared, religious tradition. Whereas Copts that come to the US, they're not going to other, I mean, they may like go to other Catholic churches, they're going to the Coptic, the dozens upon hundreds of Coptic churches that are in the United States. And that is the site of Egyptian nationalism. And so you see, a specific Egyptian nationalism. So you see a lot of Egyptian consulate and embassy folks that come to, church like events, whether it be like a Christmas liturgy or other events, doing those kind of lobbying efforts. And so the Egyptian government definitely knows what is happening in terms of demographics in the US-based diaspora, and they are acting accordingly, I would say.
Thank you. So another question is about, I'll just read it. One of the tensions between Muslims and Copts in Egypt are their differences in personal status laws. And yet the church is at the forefront of opposing civil alternatives. Why? And I have to say, just to interfere here, because I lived in Lebanon for 5 years, actually in Lebanon, like both Muslim and Christian leaders always disagree, but when it comes to civil marriage, they always are on the same page. They both opposed civil marriage for decades. It was finally approved a few years ago, but that's one of the reasons they can disagree with each other. They can hate each other, but when it came to personal status law and civil marriage, they were totally in agreement. So just to talk about Copts and like compare it to what's happening also and what happened in Lebanon. Yeah, go ahead, please, Candace.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I can mention this at the end of my answer, but there's a whole other kind of transnational story to this too, in particular. But I mean, the reason that the church would be at the forefront and has been at the forefront of opposing civil alternatives is that there's a way in which the church kind of maintains its control, like over the Coptic community, especially in Egypt, when questions of marriage and divorce are only contained within the Coptic church's kind of political and social orbit. And this has produced, until very recently, some very heartbreaking like cases for young Coptic men and women. And so part of them opposing alternatives is that the church kind of sees itself in Egypt, but I would also argue abroad, as the representative of all Coptic Christians. And so in losing that particular source of power, it lends itself to a diminishing of the Coptic church's social, cultural, and political role over Copts in Egypt. Again, like that has changed actually over the past like few years, I think because of, to be honest with you, I think because of the fact that you had a lot of Copts that are immigrating abroad, and you have a lot of Copts who, let's say in the United States in particular, who do have civil alternatives to, you know, they can get married like, you know, civilly, and you know, and that's it. And they can get divorced civilly and marry in another church entirely. So how do you kind of control a community that has other options? If they are experiencing domestic violence, if they are experiencing, you know, other forms of injury that should result like in divorce, but are not allowed to divorce in the Coptic Church until recently. Of course, they're going to seek recourse outside of the church's orbit because they have freedom to do so abroad. So I think that the church, in changing some of its rules on divorce in recent years, that has been a result of the sheer number of Copts that are abroad, and the ways in which they need to maintain the kind of similar, that it's not canon law, but like similar kind of canon law status of like the global church is a way of gesturing towards those demographic changes of the community overall. But they oppose it because, you know, they did have opposed it in the past because of its sheer kind of cultural, political, and social power over the community overall.
Thank you. So I have a question for you, actually, Candace, while we are waiting for questions. So one of my question, going back to talking about the green card lottery, because
Yes.
I even remember when I read the book and like about the number of people who managed to get the green card lottery is quite mind-boggling. Like you would
Yes.
think, like I can understand that people are saying, like, is there something like intentional about that? It's not like really random. So I wonder if you tried to talk to somebody in the State Department or to get to the bottom of this, or if this is going like, or did you face closed doors? So I wonder if you try to do anything about that to find out more. Like it is quite like, yeah, like so many people from this village are getting the green card lottery. Like how lucky could they be? Like the whole village.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to like the fieldwork question too. I mean, I really went with how can I answer certain questions? And I went to different people and different sites in order to find those answers. So for example, in 2016, it was there, you know, I encountered this priest when I was thinking about different sites, like what were going to be my main field sites for this project, and settled on you know, Jersey City, but you know, New Jersey more broadly. One of the priests that I encountered there were like, there are so many people coming on this green card lottery. It must be a conspiracy. So I thought that was really interesting, like knowing from the outside that it is, you know, it is a lottery system. And so I decided, you know, the first trip that I went to Egypt for the main field work, like in early 2017, I randomly was able to get connected with somebody at the U.S. Embassy there, and who initially worked on visas, but then I talked with other people, like for example, at the time, like the spokesperson of the embassy too, about this question, or about this like this perception that there is a conspiracy to evacuate the Middle East of its Christians, and particularly Egypt, which is, you know, the Coptic Christian community is the largest remaining community in the Middle East. And what they would say is that, well, no, it's like it is a random selection. So you have to think about, okay, well, if more people are applying for it, more people are going to get it. And that was their reasoning too. So like if in a particular village, because this is what, you know, some of the priests would say, like a whole village came through the green card lottery, but we don't know who came on the green card lottery versus, you know, family reunification versus like, you know, they came on a visa and claimed, you know, asylum, etc. But the State Department would say specifically, like it is a random selection. However, what they would say too, and this came from like a joint conversation with folks both in visa services, but also kind of more political aspect of the State Department that I had a meeting with at one point in time. One of them said, it's quite interesting that Coptic churches in the in Egypt would be supportive of those applying to the green card lottery. And I talk about this in the book that there are computer centers at most churches throughout Egypt that help Christians and some Muslims that come to the church apply for the green card lottery every October. Why would the church do that, knowing at the same time that they are losing community members? And part of this gets back to the kind of the earlier question about financial networks and remittances back to Egypt and how that kind of foments divisions, maybe further divisions between Muslims and Christians. And so I thought that was really interesting that the State Department would be, or, in conversation with those folks, would be so blunt about the stakes of the church's role in helping those apply every year.
Mm-hmm. So my other question for you is about actually regional migratory patterns, because for a long time, like when I lived in Iraq, like people always talked, oh, like Egyptians are like always migrate because they don't have many opportunities. And there was this kind of sensibility that a lot of Egyptians are in the Gulf. So I wonder if there are certain patterns that changed with time. Like, was there at one point like the Gulf countries in the 80s, 90s were more appealing, and now people are coming to the United States? I know this takes you into the Egyptians' migration into the Gulf, and I'm not sure if you looked at that, but I wonder if you have any ideas about that in terms of changing centers of migration. That at one sometimes for example Iraqis or Lebanese would prefer to go to the Gulf because they will be close to their families. So I wonder if if you've seen any change or any discussion about changing migratory patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question only because, I mean, a lot of the evacuation, the absence, in the landscape of Upper Egypt, whether in apartment buildings, these villas, etc. I mean, that obviously also began before the green card lottery too, in the circulations of certain folks, particularly men, to the Gulf, to Kuwait, as well as Saudi Arabia, to work and bring money back. But they really rarely came back to these villages. Only their money did. And one of the central figures of the book, which comes out most especially in chapter 2, but throughout the book itself, his name is Amin in the book, worked both in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but is now back in the village and is having to deal with almost the entirety of his other, family members getting the green card lottery and coming to New Jersey. And so kind of thinking about the shifts in that more temporary migration simply for kind of sending remittances back versus, I mean, because they didn't become citizens, right? They couldn't become citizens. And also, I mean, part of it too, just as an aside, is that they were also Christians in these predominantly Muslim-like contexts and had to experience other forms of marginalization and discrimination that much different than coming to the United States as a majority Christian nation and permanently settling here. So it's a different kind of elements, I think, of migration that render different connections to these places, both temporary and permanent, but also the opening of different migratory ways, for example, after the green card lottery was instated in the early 1990s, that shifted the demographics of who was going where, I would say.
Thank you. So my last question for you, I think we have 2 minutes. So I have a question about Copts and the imagination that they are the descendants of ancient Egyptians. So I wonder if you can give a very quick overview, because we have only 4 minutes almost, about like when did that discourse, like Copts as being the ancient Egyptians, when did that emerge? Any reconfigurations of that discourse? So if you can just say a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a way to answer this, I think, as like a secular historian would, to say like, oh, well, it started when the British told people that they told Copts that they were the descendants of the ancient Egyptians. And I think that actually, I think it evacuates a lot of the ways in which like ancient Egypt has and always has been infused with Coptic Christianity. And I think that even the same could be said to one degree or another of thinking about modern day Assyrians and thinking about the ancient Assyrian Empire, or thinking about Mesopotamia, et cetera. There are definitely connections there. So I think, though, that the way in which the thinking about Copts as the descendants of the pharaohs, in terms of genetics, like in terms of like literally like extracting blood and thinking about like their genetic connections, their blood connections to the mummies at the Egyptian Museum or whatever, wherever else, that particular angle of thinking about their connection to ancient Egyptians, I think has a very particular historical marker that has been discussed by Elise Burton, who's at, I think, at University of Toronto, has a book on thinking about like the push for thinking about these genetic connections between not only like Copts and ancient Egyptians, but a bunch of different other ancient communities too at the early 20th century. I think the book is Genetic Crossroads. In any case, I think that the push for thinking about Copts as the descendants, the genetic descendants, comes from a particular colonial rhetoric of kind of circling back to these entanglements between kind of like religion and race, not only in building the Egyptian nation and thinking about Copts as the origins of that nation, the living origins of that nation, but that there was this way in which they're not just the living origins, they are the truest and purest Egyptians that there could be. They are the real Egyptians. And I think that rhetoric continues to play out until today in thinking about not only Coptic connections to Egypt, but also the ways in which Copts as a persecuted minority in Egypt continue to face both their perceived foreignness, but also their indigenous connections to the land itself. So.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you both, Dr. Lukasik. We look forward to reading your book. In our chat, there's a code to pre-order it with a discount for you. And Dr. Saleh, thank you for being a wonderful discussant and interlocutor about the incredible kind of ideas in this book as well. We look forward to seeing all of you at our next Crown seminar on February 5th with Gregory Goss and Eva Bellet, who will be discussing, was the U.S. ever hegemonic in the Middle East? American power and regional disorder in the post-Cold War Middle East. It's going to be quite a seminar. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.